Many yearly May Day celebrations feature the raising of the maypole, with some maypoles reaching heights of up to 50 feet. Most commonly, these maypoles are erected in the center of village squares, country inns, community parks, or outdoor social arenas. The actual lifting of the huge pole into a secure shaft in the ground is no easy matter, and is usually lifted into place by the men within the local community. Armed with long rods tied together with rope at one end, the men use the sticks to lift the maypole higher and higher until it can be placed into position within the ground. Celebrations featuring the raising of the maypole have their origins in ancient Egypt, with the raising of the Djed pillar ceremonies. Rather than trying to stamp out the pre-Christian solstice festival of the raising the Djed and associated activities that they considered to be pagan, the early Catholic Church found it useful to co-opt the tradition by associating it with Christian celebrations. Before us, we have the example of a stone tablet with a depiction of the tree of life at its center. Our focus will be on the central column for the trunk or stalk of the pole ground. The first symbol that we will compare to the component design of the tree of life is that of the maypole. The second symbol that we will compare and correlate to the tree of life and its component design of creation is that of the Djed pillar. Let's continue with its historical tradition referred to as the raising of the Djed. The Djed pillar was an important part of the ceremony called Raising the Djed, which was a part of the celebrations of Heb-Sed, the Egyptian pharaoh's Jubilee celebrations. The act of raising the Djed has been explained as representing Osiris's triumph over Set. Ceremonies in Memphis are described where the pharaoh, with the help of the priests, raised a wooden Djed column using ropes. The ceremony took place during the period when fields were sown and the year's agricultural season would begin, corresponding to the month of Choyak, the fourth month of the inundation season called Akhet. This ceremony was a part of one of the more popular holidays and celebrations of the time, a larger festival dedicated to Osiris conducted from the 13th to the 30th day of the Choyak month. Celebrated as it was at the time of the year when the soil and climate were most suitable for agriculture, the festival and its ceremonies can be seen as an appeal to Osiris, who was the god of vegetation, to favor the growth of the seeds sown, paralleling his own resurrection and renewal after his murder by Seth. Further celebrations surrounding the raising of the Djed are described in a relief in Amenhotep III's Luxor temple. In the tomb in the temple, the scene shows the raising of the Djed pillar taking place in the morning of Amenhotep III's third Heb-Sed, which took place in his 37th regnal year. The scene is described by Sigrid Hodel Hoens. The anthropomorphized pillar stands at the middle left, in a shrine. It has taken the shape of a human body, with the Djed pillar as its head. The eyes are Ujat eyes. The hands hold the crook and flail, the usual insignia of Osiris, the god of the dead. On its head is the tall feather crown with the solar disk. The pillar is on a high base reminiscent of the platforms visible today in many temples, on which the cult barks once stood. In front of and behind it are lotus and papyrus blossoms. Beneath the large slab of the base are two tall offering stands. One bears a libation vessel, while flowers have been laid on the other. To the right is the king himself, presenting a generously laid table. Fowl, cucumbers, blossoms, breads, and heads and ribs of beef are all lying on the upper mat, while a cow and an antelope can be seen on the lower one. Beneath these mats are 4 tall vessels containing unguents and oil, with bundles of lettuce sticking out among them. The vulture goddess, Djed, the mistress of the Pernu shrine, has spread her protective wings above the sovereign with the blue crown on his head. There is also a scene depicted in the tomb to the right of the above scene which has not been well preserved. Hodel Hoens explains that it once showed the pharaoh, accompanied by his queen, using a rope to raise the Djed pillar. 3 men, probably priests of the Temple of Memphis, help him in the process. A 4th priest was seen supporting the pillar. Various offerings were presented before the pillar below the ropes. Both the pharaoh and his queen are each accompanied by 4 pairs of young women, resembling those of the said festival. Each of these women is rattling a Hathor sistrum, a musical instrument for percussion with a U-shaped handle and frame seen as resembling the face and horns of the cow goddess Hathor, while holding a manat, a protective amulet associated with Hathor, in the other hand. A line of hieroglyphs running just above the girls' heads in each row of women says, "Children of the king praising or charming the noble Djed pillar." Hodel Hoens interprets this as identifying the girls as the daughters of Amenhotep III. There are 3 additional reliefs below these 2 reliefs. They depict further ceremonies that accompany the erection of the Djed pillar, especially games and dances. In one, food bearers carrying edibles weave between men dancing with heavy steps. A line of singers on the far left seems to sing a short hymn to Ta, the text of which is written alongside the line. Singing and dancing girls can be seen in the next relief, though Hodel Hoens comments on their seeming lack of grace, saying, "Only the raised hands and the foot swinging in the air hint at the movements of a dance." The relief also depicts men involved in a boxing match and a cane dance, sports and dances which can still be seen in Egypt today. The festival of the Raising of the Djed also involved reenactments conducted at Dendera, Edfu, Busiris, Memphis, and Philae. But the most elaborate and grand celebration occurred at Abydos, the cult center of Osiris. From around the end of the 3rd millennium BC, during the beginning of the 12th dynasty, and perhaps as early as the 6th dynasty, 300 years earlier, reenactments of the myth of Osiris and Isis, the deception and murder of Osiris by Seth, the search for Osiris by Isis and Osiris' mummification, funeral, and his resurrection were performed. From the late 4th century BC, a recitation of the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, a poem describing Isis and Nephthys' search for Osiris, was added to the ceremony on the 25th day of the Choyak month. At the Osiris temple in Abydos, these reenactments are described as involving hundreds of priests and priestesses in the roles of the gods and goddesses, with 34 papyrus boats carrying the gods, a sculpture of Osiris inside an elaborate chest, 365 ornamental lamps, incense, and dozens of Djed amulets. Comparisons between the Egyptian god Osiris versus the Assyrian god Assur. Parallels have also been drawn between the Djed pillar and various items in other cultures. Sidney Smith in 1922 first suggested a parallel with the Assyrian sacred tree when he drew attention to the presence of the upper 4 bands of the Djed pillar and the bands that are present in the center of the vertical portion of the tree. He also proposed a common origin between Osiris and the Assyrian god Assur, with whom he said the sacred tree might be associated. Cohen and Kangas suggest that the tree is probably associated with the Sumerian god of male fertility, Enki, and that for both Osiris and Enki, an erect pole, or pole-like symbol, stands beneath a celestial symbol. They also point out that the Assyrian king is depicted in proximity to the sacred tree, which is similar to the depiction of the pharaoh in the Raising of the Djed ceremony. Additionally, the sacred tree and the Assyrian winged disk, which are generally depicted separately, are combined in certain designs, similar to the Djed pillar, which is sometimes surmounted with a solar disk. The Maypole, Symbolism of Fertility, and the Egyptian Fertility Pole. The May Day traditions and their customs of festival and celebration have their origins in ancient Egypt. The upright and erected trunk of the Maypole symbolically represents the erect phallus of the Egyptian god and king Osiris, and is an ancient symbol of fertility. For thousands of years, both the phallic symbols of Egyptian fertility poles and Egyptian obelisks were objects of worship and reverence as a reminder of the sacred act of sex, male regenerative powers, and the phallus of the kings who rule the world. The pole represents the male principle, and the ribbons that wrap around it, and the wreath placed atop the pole, are symbolic of the female principle. The Maypole itself is a phallic symbol, representing the planting of the god's phallus into the Mother Earth's womb, thereby illustrating the bringing forth of new life. As the Maypole represents the phallus of God, the wreath atop represents the vagina of the goddess. As the Maypole is danced, the ribbons wind around the pole and the wreath lowers, symbolizing the divine marriage, the sexual union of God and goddess. Maya, the goddess, and the May Queen receives his seed, and the fertility of their union brings forth new life in the spring. For thousands of years, both the phallic symbols of Egyptian fertility poles and Egyptian obelisks were objects of worship and reverence as a reminder of the sacred act of sex, male regenerative powers, and the phallus of the kings who rule the world. The pole represents the male principle, and the ribbons that wrap around it, and the wreath placed atop the pole, are symbolic of the female principle. The Maypole itself is a phallic symbol, representing the planting of the god's phallus into the Mother Earth's womb, thereby illustrating the bringing forth of new life. As the Maypole represents the phallus of God, the wreath atop represents the vagina of the goddess. As the Maypole is danced, the ribbons wind around the pole and the wreath lowers, symbolizing the divine marriage, the sexual union of God and goddess. Maya, the goddess, and the May Queen receives his seed, and the fertility of their union brings forth new life in the spring. Having learned about the Egyptian origins of the raising of the Maypole and the raising of the Djed, we will learn more about the history of the Maypole and the rituals of tradition celebrating regeneration, rebirth, and the renewal of life. Let's begin with the Maypole and the Maypole's history. A Maypole is a tall wooden pole generally referred to as the Maj-Tre, May tree, or midsummer pole. Most Maypole festivals occur on May Day, or the 1st of May, Pentecost, or at midsummer. The Maypole tradition is observed in Jamaica, Nicaragua, some parts of Europe, and European communities in America. Although there exists some historical connection between the Maypole tree and the Christmas tree, the Maypole tree is more commonly associated with spring or midsummer. Traditionally, a Maypole tree is cut in early spring when plant life is just starting to become abundant again and when life is at its most regenerative. The tree is then stripped of most of its branching, leaving the trunk of its pole to be erected and then decorated as part of a yearly festival around which a Maypole dance often takes place. Just as spring and midsummer are associated with the blossoming of floral buds and the emergence of bright green leaves, the spring and summer traditions of May Day and the Maypole are symbolic of the start of a new spiritual cycle, the start of life's journey, a new spiritual path, or the very end of it. Before us, we have an example of a Maypole that has been garnished with colorful ribbon. In its symbolism of the celestial pillar of the world tree, we can position the Maypole to align with the central column of the trunk or stalk of the pole ground upon the tree of life. In various parts of the world, yearly celebrations of the Maj-Tre, or May tree, take place in the spring during the month of May. Cultural festivals celebrating the Maypole still take place in parts of the Caribbean, Central and South America, and some parts of Europe. Let's take a trip to Jamaica, Nicaragua, and Germany to experience these festive celebrations of life. The Maypole in Jamaica, the long ribbon pole. Maypole, also referred to as the long ribbon pole in Jamaica, is a part of outdoor social festivals, also fairs, garden parties, or picnics. It involves the plaiting of different colored ribbons, demonstrating 3 basic traditional patterns, starting with the grand chain, or basket weave, wrapping of the ribbons around the pole from the top. There are various styles in Maypole, more popular being the spiderweb, flare, dome, and umbrella. The Maypole in Nicaragua, Palo de Mayo. In Nicaragua, Belize, the Bay Islands of Honduras, and the Bocas del Toro in Panama, the Maypole is referred to as Palo de Mayo. It is also the name given to the month-long May Day festival celebrated in the Caribbean. Both the festival and dance are an Afro-Nicaraguan tradition which originated in Bluefields, Nicaragua in the 17th century. Come take a ride on the Bluefield Express. Sit down inside on the Bluefield Express. Palo de Mayo, or Maypole, is a celebration welcoming rain, production, new life, and includes a maypole, which is a tall wooden pole decorated with several long, colored ribbons suspended from the top. These Afro-Caribbean dance festivals incorporate sensual movements with elements of Shango, a West African religion, and features the act of spirit possession. They are generally conducted at night by moonlight. Children adorn the maypole tree branches with mangoes, pineapples, and breadfruit, and dance in a circle and then plunder the tree. In Belize, festival participants plait the ribbon of the maypole, compete in coconut tree climbing and greasy pole climbing competitions. During festival dances, a custom-made music genre called Palo de Mayo can be heard playing. Palo de Mayo music is an electric reworking of Creole acoustic folk music called amento. Palo de Mayo music retains a lot of the mento style, including lyrics, melodies, and choral patterns, but speeds up the tempo and replaces different instruments as it progresses. Instruments in a Palo de Mayo ensemble include tap drums, horn sections, electric guitar, electric bass, and portable electric organ. The Maypole in Europe, the Midsummer Pole. European countries such as Germany, Austria, Sweden, and Finland celebrate what is traditionally known as May Day. The yearly May Day celebration consists of a decorated tree or tree trunk that is usually erected on the 1st of May. In Baden and Swabia, the Maypole is referred to as the Midsummer Pole, that is erected on the evening before April 30th. A Maypole dance is performed by pairs of boys and girls, or men and women, who stand alternately around the base of the pole, each holding the end of a ribbon. They weave in and around each other, boys going one way and girls going the other, and the ribbons are woven together around the pole until the merrymakers meet at the base. There are also more complex dances involving weaves, unweaves, and intricate braiding. Maypole symbolism and the universal cosmos. Cosmological views hold that the universe is a world tree. Some scholars classify maypoles as symbols of the world axis or the axis mundi of the world tree. According to ancient belief systems, the maypole is said to be symbolic of the tree of life, and that the garnishment of colorful ribbon around its central pole or pillar is a symbolic and ritualistic reverence for sacred trees and wooden pillars. In certain beliefs and philosophies, the axis mundi, also referred to as the celestial pole, cosmic axis, world pillar, center of the world, or world tree, is the world center, or the connection between heaven and earth. As the celestial pole and geographic pole, it expresses a point of connection between sky and earth where the four compass directions meet. It is believed that this point of connection facilitates travel and correspondence between the higher and lower realms, wherein communication from lower realms may ascend to higher ones, and blessings from higher realms may descend to lower ones and be disseminated to all. This focal point of communication functions as the omphalos, or navel, which marks the world's point of beginning. So far, we've learned about the history and the symbolism of the Maypole, the Djed pillar, and the cultural festivities of ritual and tradition that celebrate the world pillar and the world tree as the universal foundation of life. Moving forward, we'll learn about additional symbols in history whose biblical, esoteric, and hermetic origins can be directly correlated to the axis mundi of the world pillar and the tree of life. The staff of Moses and the rod of Aaron. According to the book of Exodus in the Bible, the staff or rod used by Moses was by his side throughout several biblical events. Among these miraculous occurrences was Moses' staff being transformed into a snake and back, Moses' staff being used to part the Red Sea, Moses' staff being used to produce water from a rock, and finally, Moses' staff being used in prayer over Israel in battle. The staff is first mentioned in the book of Exodus, chapter 4, verse 2, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush. God asks what Moses has in his hand, and Moses answers, a staff. In the King James Version, he states a rod. The staff is then miraculously transformed into a snake and then back into a staff. The staff is thereafter referred to as the rod of God or the staff of God, depending on the translation. In Egypt, Moses and Aaron appeared before the Pharaoh, and Aaron's rod was transformed into a serpent. The Pharaoh's sorcerers were also able to transform their own rods into serpents. However, Aaron's rod swallows them. Aaron's rod is also used to turn the Nile blood red and to initiate the plagues of Egypt. It is during the Exodus from Egypt where Moses stretched out his hand with the staff to part the Red Sea. While in the wilderness after having left Egypt, Moses follows God's command to strike a rock with the rod to create a spring for the Israelites to drink from. However, Moses strikes the rock twice with the staff when the water does not immediately appear after the first strike. Having struck the rock twice, implying a lack of faith, God punished Moses by not letting him enter into the promised land. And finally, Moses uses the staff once again in the battle at Rephidim between the Israelites and the Amalekites. When he holds up the rod of God, the Israelites prevail. When he drops it, their enemies gain the upper hand. Aaron and Hur help him to keep the staff raised until victory is achieved. In later Jewish legend, the rod was said to have been created at the beginning of the world on the sixth day of creation and to have been passed down through the hands of major patriarchs before being inherited by Moses. Let's now engage in a brief study and examination of biblical scripture, where we can come to understand the symbolic meaning of both the staff and the rod. We will read from the Holy Bible, the King James Version, and will reference the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 4, which states that the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. This entire scene illustrates the condition of the soul in the desert, whose symbolic meaning means physical life. The soul in the way simply means the soul that travels from Egypt, whose symbolic meaning means bondage of the ego, to the promised land, whose symbolic meaning is a heavenly awakening from this bondage. In other words, the Israelites' travels represent the individual who was on a spiritual journey to shed the ego and experience the promised land, spiritual resurrection. From the Holy Bible, the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 8 through 9, it states that, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass, that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole." So God gives Moses a symbolic representation of what would heal them. That symbol is the brazen snake on the pole lifted up. The snake was cast down, yet must be lifted up, symbolically transforming the ego to restore the spiritual aspect of man's soul. From the Holy Bible, the book of John, chapter 3, verse 14, we have, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." From the Holy Bible, the book of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, it states that, "Remember, the kingdom of God is not outside of you, but is within." Lifting up the Son of Man is another way of symbolizing the path to elevated states of conscious awareness, a state of being beyond the senses, emotions, and intellect. Large portions of Scripture are metaphors for the holy temple, which is your human body and brain. If you stood a snake in the upright position, it would resemble the spinal cord, which extends up the back. The head of the snake would resemble the pineal gland, understood by the ancients as a spiritual organ, at the bottom center of the brain. In deep meditation practices, spiritual energy, Kundalini or Holy Spirit, rises through the spinal column and proceeds to open the seven chakras, or the seven churches of revelations, along the spine until it reaches the pineal gland, symbolizing a spiritually resurrected individual. This process can also be seen as the serpent that becomes transformed from the ego into the fully realized and awakened spiritual being, or the shedding of the ego. Such an experience raises the conscious awareness of an individual beyond the senses. This is a real experience that ancient spiritual peoples were aware of. It is the true nature of our aboriginal origins that lay within us and must be exalted in order to realize this spiritual resurrection. The Rod of Asclepius. The rod of Asclepius, also known as the staff of Asclepius, is a serpent-entwined rod associated with healing and medicine. In modern times, where it is associated with medicine and healthcare, it is frequently confused with the staff of Hermes, known as the caduceus. The rod of Asclepius takes its name from the god Asclepius, a deity associated with healing and medicinal arts in Greek mythology. In honor of Asclepius, a particular type of non-venomous snake was often used in healing rituals, and these snakes, the Asclepian snakes, crawled around freely on the floor in dormitories where the sick and injured slept. These snakes were introduced at the founding of each new temple of Asclepius throughout the classical world. From about 300 BCE onwards, the cult of Asclepius grew very popular, and pilgrims flocked to his healing temples, Asclepia, to be cured of their ills. Ritual purification would be followed by offerings or sacrifices to the gods, or according to the means, and the supplicant would then spend the night in the holiest part of the sanctuary, the abaton or iditon. Any dreams or visions would be reported to a priest who would prescribe the appropriate therapy by a process of interpretation. Some healing temples also used sacred dogs to lick the wounds of sick petitioners. The original Hippocratic oath began with the invocation, "I swear by Apollo the physician, and by Asclepius, and by Hygeia, and Panacea, and by all the gods." The serpent and the staff appear to have been separate symbols that were combined at some point in the development of the Asclepian cult. The significance of the serpent has been interpreted in many ways. Sometimes the shedding of the skin and renewal is emphasized as symbolizing rejuvenation, while other assessments center on the serpent as a symbol that unites and expresses the dual nature of the work of the physician, who deals with life and death, as well as sickness and health. Ningajida. Ningajida is a Mesopotamian deity of the underworld. The name in Sumerian is translated as Lord of the Good Tree. In Sumerian mythology, Ningajida appears in Adap's myth as one of the two guardians of Anu's celestial palace alongside Dumuzi. Sometimes depicted as a serpent with a human head, Ningajida is the earliest known symbol of two snakes twining around an axial rod. This representation predates the caduceus of Hermes, the rod of Asclepius, and the biblical Nehushtan of Moses by more than a millennium. Djed, the serpent goddess of Lower Egypt from the pre-dynastic period, demonstrates the earliest known representation of a single serpent entwined around a pole, in this case a papyrus reed. Caduceus. The caduceus is the staff carried by Hermes in Greek mythology, and consequently by Hermes Trismegistus in Greco-Egyptian mythology. It is a short staff entwined by two serpents, sometimes surmounted by wings. In Roman iconography, it was often depicted being carried in the left hand of Mercury, the messenger of the gods, guide of the dead, and protector of merchants, shepherds, gamblers, liars, and thieves. Some accounts suggest that the oldest known imagery of the caduceus have their roots in a Mesopotamian origin with the Sumerian god Ningajida, whose symbol, a staff with two snakes intertwined around it, dates back to 4000 BC to 3000 BC. In astrology and alchemy, the caduceus was associated with the elemental metal of mercury. It is said that the caduceus wand would wake the sleeping and send the awake to sleep. If applied to the dying, their death was gentle. If applied to the dead, they returned to life. The caduceus is often incorrectly used, particularly in North America, as a symbol of healthcare organizations and medical practice, due to confusion with the traditional medical symbol for the rod of Asclepius. Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, carried a staff with one serpent wrapped around it, and is formally known as the rod of Asclepius. Moses also had a replica of a serpent on a pole called the Nehushtan, which is more popularly referred to as the staff of Moses. Alternate representations for a rod, a staff, and serpents include the Greek Kerukion, which features two snakes atop the staff or rod, crossed to create a circle with the heads of the snakes resembling horns. Serpent symbolism. The serpent, or snake, is one of the oldest and most widespread mythological symbols and represents the dual expression of good and evil. In some cultures, snakes were fertility symbols. The Hopi people of North America performed an annual snake dance to celebrate the union of Snake Youth, a sky spirit, and Snake Girl, an underworld spirit, and to renew the fertility of nature. In other cultures, snakes symbolized the umbilical cord, joining all humans to Mother Earth. They were also worshipped as guardians of her mysteries of birth and regeneration. The vision serpent was also a symbol of rebirth in Mayan mythology, with origins going back to earlier Maya conceptions lying at the center of the world as the Mayans conceived it. It is in the center axis atop the world tree. Essentially, the world tree and the vision serpent, representing the king, created the center axis, which communicates between the spiritual and the earthly worlds or planes. It is through ritual that the king could bring the center axis into existence in the temples and create a doorway to the spiritual world, and with it, power. In combination with similar concepts such as the world tree, axis mundi, or world axis, the tree of life is represented by a staff, such as those used by shamans. Examples of such staffs featuring coiled snakes in mythology are the caduceus of Hermes, the rod of Asclepius, the staff of Moses, and the papyrus reeds and deity poles entwined by a single serpent Djed, dating to earlier than 3000 BCE. The oldest known representation of two snakes entwined around a rod is that of the Sumerian fertility god Ningazida. Ningazida was sometimes depicted as a serpent with a human head, eventually becoming a god of healing and magic. It is the companion of Dumuzi or Tammuz, with whom it stood at the gate of heaven. Naga is the Sanskrit word for a deity or class of entity or being, taking the form of a very large snake, found in Hinduism and Buddhism. The Naga primarily represents rebirth, death, and mortality due to its casting of its skin and being symbolically reborn. Brahmins associated Naga with Shiva and with Vishnu, who rested on a 100-headed Naga coiled around Shiva's neck. The snake represented freedom in Hindu mythology because they cannot be tamed. In many Mesoamerican cultures, the serpent was regarded as a portal between two worlds. In many myths, the chthonic serpent, sometimes a pair, lives in or is coiled around a tree of life situated in a divine garden. In the Genesis story of the Torah and the biblical Old Testament, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is situated in the Garden of Eden, together with the tree of life and the serpent. In Greek mythology, Ladon coiled around the tree in the Garden of the Hesperides, protecting the entheogenic golden apples. In the Hebrew Bible, the serpent in the Garden of Eden lured Eve with the promise of being like God, tempting her that despite God's warning, death would not be the result, and that God was withholding knowledge from her. The serpent is identified as having hidden knowledge. From the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 1, it states, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord had made." Additional examples of reference from biblical scripture can be found in the book of Exodus, chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, where it states, "The staff of Moses transformed into a snake and then back into a staff." The book of Numbers, chapter 21, verses 6 through 9, provides an origin for an archaic copper snake known as Nehushtan and associating it with Moses. This copper snake, Nehushtan, according to the biblical text, is wrapped around a pole and used for healing. The book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 9, states, "And Moses made a snake of copper and put it upon a pole, and it came to pass that if a snake had bitten any man, when he beheld the snake of brass, he lived." Raku Kai Reike, also known as the Way of the Fire Dragon, where Ningizida is believed to be a fire serpent of Tibetan rather than Sumerian origin. Ningizida is another name for the ancient Hindu concept of Kundalini, a Sanskrit word meaning either coiled up or coiling like a snake. Kundalini refers to the mothering intelligence beyond yogic awakening and spiritual maturation leading to altered states of consciousness. Serpent power and the symbol of snakes coiled around a staff is an ancient representation of Kundalini physiology. The staff represents the spinal column, with the snakes being energy channels. In the case of two coiled snakes, they usually cross each other 7 times, a possible reference to the 7 energy centers called chakras. Historically, serpents and snakes represent fertility or a creative life force. As snakes shed their skin through sloughing, they are symbols of rebirth, transformation, immortality, and healing. The Ouroboros is a symbol of eternity and continual renewal of life. The serpent, when forming a ring with its tail in its mouth, is a clear and widespread symbol of the all in all, the totality of existence, infinity, and the cyclic nature of the cosmos. The most well-known version of this is the Egypto-Greek Ouroboros. It is believed to have been inspired by the Milky Way, as some ancient texts refer to a serpent of light residing in the heavens. The constellation Serpens represents a snake being tamed by Ophiuchus, the snake handler, another constellation. The most probable interpretation is that Ophiuchus represents the healer Asclepius. Throughout part 1 of this video presentation, our focus has been on the central column of the trunk or stalk of the pole ground, as well as the tree of life, for which both have been configured in their carving to be within the center of the universe of the stone tablet before us. We have also come to understand that together, both the celestial pole and the world tree represent the universal foundation, and that all life is supported by its existence. As such, various cultures around the world celebrate the world tree as the primary source of regeneration, rebirth, and renewal. We've learned that cultural festivities related to the raising of the Maypole and the raising of the Djed have their origins in ancient Egypt. Over the course of history, we've learned about the biblical, esoteric, and hermetic representations of the world pole, as well as other symbolic representations of the world tree. And finally, there should be 2 questions that arise. The first question that should come to mind is why I have used this particular stone tablet as a foundation to illustrate by example the historical reverence and significance of both the world pillar and the tree of life. The second question that should come to mind is why I refer to this stone tablet as the center of the universe. In order to find out why, watch part 2 of this video series. Well, that's it for this video. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified when we post new videos. Until next time.